Welcome to the Lalulah podcast, real-life conversations about modern sexuality and how to live a happy, healthy, turned-on life. I'm your host, Laura Allen, a holistic health coach and founder of Lalulah, an online platform offering natural erotica toys as well as the educational tools you need to expand your pleasure in and outside the bedroom. Welcome back to another episode of the Lalulah podcast. Today we are getting scientific and I am interviewing Moira Bradfield, who is a naturopath, an acupuncturist, a holistic nutritional therapist, and she's currently doing her PhD on the vaginal microbiome. She is also the founder of Intimate Ecology, which is a holistic health service supporting women who experience health issues in the area of the vulva and the vagina. So in this episode, we talk about what the vagina microbiome is and how it's different to the gut microbiome. We talk about some of the things that can cause imbalances in this area, as well as what we can do today to have a happy, healthy, vibrant, beautiful pussies. This episode was really fascinating to record and I got so much out of it. As much as I love all of the Eastern esoteric and psychology behind sexuality, I'm also all about the Western science that we've got to back it up. And Moira is hugely knowledgeable in this area, so it's been really great to get her wisdom and downloads. Let's begin the show. Welcome, Moira. Thank you so much for being here this morning. It's such a pleasure to have you. Oh my gosh, you are just a woman of so many talents. When we first started emailing, I was looking at your email signature and saw that you are not only is it vagina microbiologist? Is that technically correct to say it like that?
Well, probably not in terms of a term for me.
Right.
So I am a clinician who works intimately with the vaginal microbiome, so and understanding that bacteria and microbes in that area. So that's where I'm currently studying as well. Yeah,
awesome. And you're also a naturopath, an acupuncturist, a holistic nutritional therapist, and many, many other things as well. I noticed that you are a lecturer and you've been getting some awards for that too. So yeah, just amazing to see the work that you've done. And I'm really intrigued to hear about why you went into this particular field. Like, what drew you to work specifically with the vagina microbiome and start Intimate Ecology?
Yeah, it's a really great question. So I have been a practitioner now for nearly 20 years. And in my clinical practice, in terms of holistic therapy, we do see a lot of females. There's a much higher percentage of female clients that come into holistic care. And one of the things I found probably about 4 years ago now was that I had a big run of clients that had quite non-specific vaginal discharges. So they weren't necessarily thrush and they weren't necessarily bacterial vaginosis, but they were adamant that these clients were adamant that they weren't normal. And I started to treat in the same way I normally would in terms of, looking at diet and how we would look at that and using antimicrobial therapies. And one of the things I realized with two clients in particular was that it just wasn't working. And so I went back to the drawing board and thought, what is it in this area that I'm not understanding or I'm not seeing? And I went back and found that what's happened since we've been able to map the human genome and we've been able to map the microbiome, so looking at all the bacterial species that inhabit different spaces within the human body, is that we've now understanding the vaginal microbiome, so the microbes in that area, to a much higher degree, and realizing that even though we do have really common infections and presentations in this area, there's a whole lot of other types of microbes that we might not be considering. So I started to throw myself into the research and trying to translate that into a way that was meaningful in terms of applying it to my clients so that I could help them to recover and to get better. And from there, it's really just grown into a special interest practice. So Intimate Ecology primarily deals with recurrent vaginal infections. So that's everything from bacterial vaginosis and recurrent thrush, which is a really big issue, into non-specific discharges or things that have happened or changed from events in people's lives to do with their vaginal and intimate health.
Beautiful. So gut health is a really big thing at the moment, and there's so much research out there on the gut microbiome and how to keep it balanced and so on and so forth. So is there a direct link between the gut microbiome and the vagina microbiome?
There is and there isn't. So the vaginal microbiome is independent of the gut, and what that means is that we find bacteria and fungus and viruses within the vagina that we don't find in the GIT, and we do find some that travel across, and some of the ones that will travel across to the vagina itself will be beneficial for us, and some of them will be what we consider to be, the term is pathobiont, meaning a microbe that has a tendency to become a pathogen or an infection if you give it the right environment to do so. So there's this crosstalk between those two areas. But what we've found what researchers have found by looking at these areas and the microbes that exist in them is that there's actually a much closer connection between the microbiome of the vagina and that of the urinary bladder. So those two microbiomes are very similar and do crosstalk a lot of microbes.
Is that where things like UTIs come into play? Because if you're seeing a lot of reoccurring thrush, does that mean that these women would also be susceptible to things like that?
Yeah, definitely. So particularly if they're getting a lot more bacterial infection. So it could be that the vagina is the primary site and then the urinary bladder has its issues and then that becomes recurrent, or it could be the other way where the bladder is where the primary issue was and then it's impacting that whole area. And there's lots of different reasons why that occurs, and that's quite individual a lot of the time in terms of personal history, antibiotic use, trauma a lot of the time comes up in those areas, and so it's about understanding that history and that journey for that person to try and modify what might be going on.
Yeah, absolutely. I like how you mentioned that because it is very individual, and I've interviewed a lot of women or practitioners in the podcast dealing with the psychology and the emotional side of, I guess, our sexuality and our sexual health. I even interviewed Grace Hazel, who had vulvodynia and really had a lot of really suffered from symptoms of that for over a decade, and that was interesting to hear about her kind of esoteric healing journey and how dealing with the trauma really started to relieve those symptoms. So it'd be cool to circle back to that a bit later, but for now I'd really love to know about I guess how do we get out of balance in there, right? Because again, I want to refer to the gut health. It's okay, so we know that maybe our gut health isn't at its optimal, so we can eat certain foods and, have lots of fermented foods and so on and so forth to sort of rebalance our gut microbiome. And it may have gotten into that state due to a series of reasons, like our environment, our stress levels, and the food that we eat, and other things as well. But what are some of the things that affect our vaginal microbiome to become unbalanced? And then what are some of the things that we can do to get it back to health and vitality?
Yeah. So, all of those things that you mentioned as influencing gut health do impact vaginal health as well. It's going to impact microbes anywhere in the body. So certainly diet and stress and those types of things are always a consideration in this area. And one of the things that we acknowledge about the vagina itself is that it is a bodily orifice that interacts with the external world in a very different way to a lot of the other types of orifices that we have. And so it's meant to have a certain amount of resilience in that it can come in contact with sex partners and different fluids and things like that. And it shouldn't necessarily then result in an infection. And for a large percentage of the population, it doesn't. That there's lots of things that you can do and carry on and have normal vaginal health. But there is at-risk populations in that people who, certainly sex is a big part of screening in my clinical practice, because there's a whole variety of different types of sexual interactions that for somebody who is at risk of what we call vaginal dysbiosis, or an imbalance in bacteria in that area, it just tends to compound that issue and put them a little bit more at risk. So sexual interaction with partners of any sex carries different influences on how microbes get into that area and how they may behave. And the vagina, as I mentioned, is quite robust, and it maintains its robustness by the microbes that it carries. And primarily in that area, lactobacilli, which is probably a microbe a lot of people have heard about in terms of using them as a probiotic for gut health. In this area, lactobacilli are the primary and dominant microbe in most people. So what they do is produce lactic acid, and they produce hydrogen peroxide as their byproducts of being a bacteria and existing in that space. And that acid actually creates the defense in that area, part of the immune system, in that the vagina, as a part of our anatomy, is meant to be quite acidic. And that acidity means that if other bacteria come in that aren't meant to exist there, essentially they shouldn't be able to survive because of the fact that there's an acid balance there. And then there's also these bacteria, the lactobacilli, can create their own little compounds that are antimicrobial compounds. So they create that and maintain that environment. So when we start losing those types of microbes, we start seeing this sort of downward spiral into ill health and recurrency of infection, particularly for bacterial infections. So we start thinking about what could be wiping out those microbes, but also what could be changing the pH, because the lactobacilli also like to exist in an acid pH, just like some of the pathogens can't. So if we have interactions that are constantly raising the pH and making it more alkaline, which is shifting above 4.5 and up to 7 or more, then we start losing lactobacilli, and we start leaving that area open to infection. So things like ejaculate, for example, and again, that's a normal input into that area, but I do find that sometimes when people are trying to conceive, or if there's a really quite frequent ejaculation, that shifts the pH on a regular basis, and for some people that results in infection tendencies. And the same with things like oral sex, which introduce microbes, but it also introduces alkaline fluids. Or if people were using practices like douching, which is not recommended these days, that also will shift those microbes and shift that pH and can make you more susceptible to infection. So when people find that they feel better after douching, if they have a discharge, it might be very short term, and then often they are then, at risk again. So those are very external things. And then internally we look towards things like hormonal balance has a really big impact in that area. So a lot of the time we're looking to see what could be happening with a menstrual cycle, or when is this discharge appearing, at what time of the month, and thinking about what hormones might be at play, because there are direct correlations between estrogen and the amount of lactobacilli, meaning that if we have good estrogen amounts, we usually are able to feed lactobacilli and have a very healthy tissue in terms of the epithelium or the cells that are in that area as well. So looking at hormonal imbalance and even changes to or prolonged menstrual cycles, that can also influence the pH in that area. So there's lots of different factors to consider, and it's not just simply looking, and this is the thing as well, a lot of practitioners will just look at this as an isolated organ, and it's really big part of a human, and everything and other systems that are working and perhaps not working to their optimum in that area.
Yeah, right. So, okay, many questions out of that. I just wanted to just go back to the beginning. Can you just unpack dysbiosis for me, just for any of the listeners, including myself, who don't have a really firm grasp on what that is?
Yeah. So dysbiosis, at its very simplest, is a term that we use for disordered microbes. So in the sense of the vagina, it means that there's an imbalance in the microbes in that area. And when I mentioned lactobacilli, a dysbiosis in the vagina means generally that there's a loss or a decline in the amount of lactobacilli and an increase in things that we call facultative anaerobic bacteria, meaning bacteria that are more likely to be pathogens or to cause issues. So these are different to infectious microbes like STIs. These are bacteria that we carry with us and exist anyway in our bodies. But if they're not kept in check, they overgrow and we have too much of them. So the disorder there is that the seesaw, which is lactobacilli, to these other types of bacteria gets flipped, and we have more of the not so good bacteria and less of the lactobacilli in that area.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you. And so I'm also hearing you say that, women who are trying to conceive and who are having lots of, unprotected sex, and they're having lots of ejaculation in their vagina, that can affect the pH levels?
Yes.
Okay, right. So would you recommend that barrier methods like condoms, or even using withdrawal, even if you are in like a long-term monogamous relationship and you're on contraception, is recommended to maintain vaginal health?
So the catch line that I always put into that is if you're having issues. Because if you're not having issues, it's not an issue.
Yeah, awesome.
Meaning that your environment is recovering fine, and certainly lots of people have lots of sex and don't have issues. But in my practice, I see those people who are having these issues chronically. So for me, there is a modification of the way that they're interacting with their partners. And that does include things like barrier methods or withdrawal, at a minimum, or, looking at different ways to interact in an intimate setting, because there needs to be, when we're looking at this area particularly and just isolating it and looking at it as a microbial population, there needs to be time for it to recover. And you can't do that if you're constantly challenging it. And so it becomes this very tricky area of negotiation where we have to look at how we can modify behaviors but still keep the joy in interaction, because certainly I don't want to modify people's sex lives where they're not having sex and they're not interacting, because that's also very damaging to relationships and how we show up in the world. So it's one of those things that if you're finding that you're having a lot of infections, or that you're noticing your discharge changes frequently, or if you're having urinary tract infections after sex, then there might need to be some sort of change that you take on in how you interact.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Love that. So I had a question come up about contraception and how that affects the vagina microbiome, especially like hormonal contraceptions. So is that something that we need to be wary of? Do you want to just maybe speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. So it does depend on the contraception. And so if we're talking about hormonal contraception, there's obviously an array of different ways that can be delivered, and also what type of hormones that contains. So in terms of estrogen containing hormonal contraceptives, so normally that's a pill, then there is suggestion that there's research that backs it up, that estrogen containing contraceptives protect the vaginal microbiome from bacterial issues, meaning that it's actually beneficial for the lactobacilli to have estrogen coming in on a regular basis. And so there would be a little bit more stability, but it does put you more at risk of thrush. So higher estrogen is a thrush issue a lot of the time. Progesterone only contraception doesn't impact the vaginal microbiome in that they don't see it change significantly. But when you're looking at things like the Mirena, for example, which has, is inserted into the cervix itself and delivers progestins, then that has an increased risk in the research has been shown for bacterial vaginosis, and that's more about it being inserted in the string than it is the hormone that it contains. So, it's again what's going into that area and causing an immune reaction or disturbing the ecology in that area. And then if you take it and move outside of hormonal contraceptives and looking at things like barrier methods, then, in terms of types of infections and how they're translocated, then they can be protective. But again, it's about the material and how you may be independently reacting to that. So we do have different types of barrier methods, and they're made of different materials. So there are latex, which latex a lot of the time carries casein, which is a dairy protein. So if you've got a dairy allergy, you can be reacting in that area as well. And then, if you can go into the vegans, but then what type of lubricants are there and how are they processed, and all of those type of things are a consideration as well. So we do want cleaner, more natural types of barrier methods as well. And certainly even sometimes access with different types of barrier methods is problematic, particularly if you're looking at female-female interaction. Accessing those things is not really spur of the moment. So it can be problematic as well.
Is there a particular brand of, say, condoms that you would recommend, or that kind of tick as many boxes as possible?
There's lots of different yes and no. So it depends. So when we're looking at them, I recommend the vegan type condoms, which generally they are, then considering other types of things like the lubricant that's contained on them. Yeah. And the vegan condoms are called vegan because they don't have the casein. So they are not having that dairy protein. It's so that is where I push people. And then you need to consider access, because a lot of people are buying these things in the supermarket and not necessarily visiting specialized stores or having the time to wait for them to arrive in the mail.
Yeah.
So there are vegan condoms that are available in the supermarket, things like the Hero, and there's one in the Skin brand as well. Those are ones that you can access. And then online, things like the Hello Johnny, those are also vegan condoms. There is sometimes issues with sizing. Not all of those brands do multiple sizes, so then that also drives choice as well. So it's to leave it sort of open for people to choose and find what works for them.
Yeah, it's a big world. We stock Johnny condoms in the store, and gosh, I've been thinking about how I can actually make it easier for people to access them, because they're buying like a $10 packet of beautiful condoms, I believe. But, then there's like shipping and wait time and all that kind of stuff. So I'm like, gosh, how can I make them more accessible for everyone? So, yeah, it's an issue.
Subscription service, maybe.
Yeah, gosh, I did. They actually offer that in Australia, and I thought about, anyway, we won't get into the logistics of my business on the podcast. But yes. There are options out there. So that's good to know. I did really want to ask you quickly about Candida. I mean, people talk about Candida all the time. I hear about it, I feel like every second day. And I feel like there's a lot of misunderstanding around Candida and what that means for us and for our vagina. So maybe you could shed some light on Candida, what it is actually, and how to sort of manage it.
Yeah, definitely. So I think the primary thing to understand is that in terms of vaginal infections that can happen that aren't STIs, Candida is actually not the most common. And we have some interesting, in some countries, and Australia is one of them, which is where I am, we have access to treatment for thrush or Candida over the counter. So there's a lot of self-diagnosis going on. And a lot of what I experience is that that's actually incorrect self-diagnosis. So not every vaginal discharge is thrush or Candida. And if it's something that's happening all the time, then you really should be going off and getting a swab done to identify if it's a bacterial or a fungal issue. So Candida is a fungus that, again, exists normally in our body, and in our normal state, it's not a problem. It just hangs around in tiny little buds and doesn't cause any issues or itch or irritation or discharge. If something goes on to allow it to overgrow, then the symptoms that come with that are a lot of itching and burning and possibly swelling and redness, and a discharge that is referred to as the cottage cheese discharge. So it's thicker and chunky, little white bits in it. It can have some clear fluid as well, and it's different to a normal cyclical discharge. And that's also something to mention there, because a discharge that changes over a month is normal. And a lot of people will come to me going, I've got this discharge. And when we get to the bottom of it, it's quite a normal discharge. It's not an issue at all. And people are accessing treatment for a normal discharge over the counter, thinking that it's also Candida. So it's an interesting situation. And I have a special interest in Candida, in recurrent Candida particularly. That's where I'm doing my research at the moment. And it's interesting because when we see recurrent pictures where it actually is confirmed on swabs. Then we have all different types of Candida that can exist. So the most common one is Candida albicans, which is what the medication over the counter works for. And then if you have a different type of Candida, that medication won't work for you, or it won't give you relief for very long periods of time. And so there are lots of reasons why, and this is a push even as a natural health practitioner, that if someone comes to me with a discharge, the first thing I want them to do, if they haven't done it already, is go get a swab and get it identified so that we know what we're dealing with, because I want to rule out that that's not bacterial vaginosis. I want to rule out that that's not normal. I want to rule out, that it's not a different type of Candida strain that we could be dealing with in a completely different way. And then once we understand that, then we need to look at what could be influencing it. And it could be hormones, it could be immune systems that overreact or underreact. It can be that you might have some metabolic risk with blood sugar levels or diabetes that's causing that to be more opportunistic. So there's lots of different factors in a recurrent Candida, and in a one-off Candida that you've never had before, a lot of the time it could be if you've taken antibiotics, or if you've had some sort of hormonal shift that's unexpected, or tried a new contraception in terms of hormones. Those type of things are quite normal, and over-the-counter treatment definitely might work then, but if it keeps happening, it needs to be investigated and dealt with as well, because it can be quite tricky and it can set in and become more recurrent and prolonged. So, yeah.
Yeah, awesome. So that's kind of leading me nicely into, I guess, the solutions part of this podcast. And that is like, how can people take care of their bodies and make sure that they are, keeping their vagina clean and healthy in a way that's going to support their microbiome? I heard you reference before that douching was not ideal. And just to be clear, that's washing with soap, right? Like commercial kind of soaps.
So, well, douching is slightly different. So douching is a practice where you actually insert a fluid into the vaginal canal to rinse it out, essentially. And there can be a whole lot of different applications, from medicated to just water-based douching. And it's often utilised, and you can buy pharmaceutical douches as well, over the counter, which are, touted to restore and decrease the smell and all of those sort of things. And so, douching has its risk because it washes out some of the microbes. It challenges the environment. It may not be pH correct. And if you're continuously douching, it puts you at risk of a thing called pelvic inflammatory disease, which is a consequence we see of other types of infections as well, like chlamydia, where we have a lot of adhesions and scarring and things like that can happen in the pelvic cavity. So it's not a great practice to get into, but people will do that. And then externally, you mentioned soaps, so certainly how you wash and deal with the vulval area of your genitalia is also important, because it can challenge the vagina as well. And the vulva has a microbiome, and it's lesser known in terms of how that works, but it is being implicated into things like vulvodynia and those type of issues as well. So certainly for me, soaps are a no-go. In some chronic pitches of particularly Candida, dermatologists will be recommending gentle, washes and things like that. And that, if that's been recommended, then that's okay. But for me, soaps should not be used in that area. Usually just a good wash with water and a soft cloth, if you need to, would be suffice. That's all you need to do, and you don't need to insert anything into the vagina unless it's been prescribed for you, essentially. And to go with that, in that this is a self-cleaning. It's meant to have things inserted into it, and those things find their way out of it, and you don't need to add to that at all.
Yeah, beautiful. I think as well, women, some women will have, issues down there that need to be addressed, but then there is this shame around discharge and the smell of our yonis, of our vaginas, and they kind of expect or want them to smell like roses and all that kind of stuff that we see on these body wash packages. But it's a beautiful exercise to actually start to release that shame and just get to know your body and understand that discharge is something that we all have. It's perfectly healthy, unless obviously you're dealing with a actual issue, and to just let your body naturally to do that and not need it to be anything else. Do you know what I mean by that? It's just
definitely.
Yeah.
And it's a great point, because discharge is normal. If you have a menstrual cycle, you have discharge that changes over the course of a month, and that does that in line with what your hormones are doing. And that is completely normal and should be celebrated. And it doesn't smell like roses or cotton candy or all those other things that are pushed out there. It smells like a vagina, and it smells like discharge. And as long as that's not offensive and fishy or coloured in a way that it hasn't been before, then it's most likely part of your normal cycle, and it should be, left that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And it should be celebrated because it's yum, and it's all part of getting to love our bodies as they are, right?
Definitely.
Yeah, awesome. What are some other ways? I kind of feel like there's just some other things. Like I had a client come to me recently saying, like, I just don't feel right down there. Like it's like my whole vagina is just saying no, and it feels gross. And she'd just come off the back of a long period. So I mean, there's like many factors that are contributing to it. But she's like, what can I do to, like, she felt like she wanted to exfoliate the inside of her vagina. That's how much she kind of felt like she wanted it to just be like wiped clean into a clean slate in there. And I was really intrigued by her story, because going back to what we were saying before about the trauma, and maybe even storing past lovers that we I don't want to be attached to anymore in that area. I sort of invited her to maybe like listen to that strong no that she was getting from that area, and just saying, maybe this is time for you to sort of not be having any penetrative sex, or even like internal penetration with yourself and so on, and just kind of listen to that, because it's potentially your yoni just wanting a break. And I also recommended a yoni steam. So I would love to know your thoughts on yoni steams and maybe some of the other alternative modalities of cleansing that area. If you had anything to say about that.
Yeah. I do, of course. First of all, I want to start off by saying I agree completely that we can't just look at any part of our body in only a physical way, and that there are many layers to humans, and healing takes place on many layers as well. And working in more of an esoteric realm is not a bad thing to do, particularly in this area, to help people move through and heal. It's just, what does that entail? Because a lot of the time it's not necessarily about performing physical acts at all. It's about what we're not doing, or how we internalize and reflect as well. And there's beautiful array of practices obviously available, from very mainstream into quite esoteric. So I would definitely support that. And then when you're looking at things that are out there that work on that, I guess for me, even being a holistic practitioner, they're still considered to be quite fringe, like yoni steaming and those type of practices. Again, for me, and I take quite a pragmatic approach to that, because part of me is very scientific and then part of me isn't, is that I still think there needs to be a good reason to do it. And there needs to be guidelines around not overusing it, because the practice of yoni steaming on a microbiome level, the impacts are unknown at this stage. So, theoretically, that's not necessarily getting right up into the vagina anyway. It's more about the external tissue and the warmth and the blood supply and all of those other beautiful things that happen. And certainly the application of herbal, not just steam baths, but sitz baths and things like that are very traditional in my profession as well, and play quite specific roles. So I think that it is a beautiful suggestion for people to go forth and do. But again, it's just like douching, don't overdo it. Have a practice and set with it, and work in other types of therapies that also complement it as well, and see what your body's reaction to that is. And because sometimes particularly looking at some of the practices, and is that people do remark that their discharge gets worse, and then that could be interpreted as being a cleansing reaction or being a healing reaction, but it also could be an area in a bit of imbalance that needs some support as well. So there has to be some, guidance through that sort of minefield as well, on what is normal and when an intervention is required versus when that will just run its course and fizzle out as well. So, I don't know if I've answered that question, but
so it's like a yes and a no.
And the place.
Yeah, right.
It's a yes and a no. Yeah. Because I've gone looking for the research, and certainly particularly, yoni steaming in terms of cultural practices holds all sorts of benefit as well for people, and connection, and certainly I enjoy warmth in that area as well, but it's just it's dependent on what is in that steam. And I know I've read some interesting research from more developing countries where there can be all sorts of drastic things in their steam baths, and right through to really strong Dettol type solutions, which is not where I would be suggesting
no.
people go. And certainly healing herbs, yes, but again, it's about how you're responding to that and how you feel and connect to that as well.
Yeah, interesting. So I guess the moral of that story is yoni steaming, but like not overdoing it. I think I read somewhere, please correct me if I'm wrong, that you wouldn't want to do any more than 2 a month, but again, it's going to be case specific, and make sure that you're only using natural herbs, and just make sure that you're not kind of overdoing it, and monitor your vaginal health before and after to make sure it's not giving you any irritation or negative side effects.
Yeah, I think that's probably a sensible guideline with the 2 a month. Again, clinically, if there was more stuff going on, you could use it more frequently in terms of infection. But I do think that sometimes I'll just recommend people to put a heat pack in that area, and that's lovely, and that could play the part of some of those if people are wanting to do a heat application more frequently as well. But it's about sensible guidelines and listening to your body. This is all about connecting to an area that is often shut down or, traumatized, abused, confused and lost. And so if you're reconnecting to that area, you really do need to listen to what's going on and how your body's responding to that as well.
Yeah, beautiful. I love that you said that. There's a whole world of knowledge that our body has down there that it's really cool to tap into and yeah, like you say, listen to. Awesome. Okay. And so I did also want to ask quickly about yoni eggs and, dildos, vibrators, sex toys, any kind of insertion tools, moon cups. Like, how do we make sure that we're having a hygienic practice with all of these things? Because I know there's a bit of research out there and there's not a lot of guidelines. So how do we make sure that we're safe when we're engaging with these practices?
Okay, so we do need to, with any inserted device, make sure that they are in really good condition, and make decisions on whether we need to discard them if they're not. So when we're looking at anything that's silicone, if it's degrading or cracked, then it needs to go. Certainly if there's any pitting, needs to go. And when we're looking at crystals and glass, again, depending upon, I know these things are touted not to be porous, but if there are any structural issues with them, then it would be something that I wouldn't be continuing that practice with. So because microbes, you can't see them, they hide out and you need to be able to cleanse and sanitize them effectively. And that's also a big part of this, because a lot of these things, you want to have so you can grab them and go and use them without having to then go into the kitchen and make sure it's sterilized and do all of these other types of practices. So sensible application of sterilization. And that is dependent upon the product and what it's actually made out of and how you may do that as well. So if we take something like a menstrual cup, because I do talk to people a lot about menstrual cups because I think they're fantastic, but they are also, like any other device that's inserted into the vagina, a possible reservoir of microbes. And you need to be mindful that you are cleansing and using them appropriately. So for menstrual cups, my recommendations are that you actually have 2. It's a good investment and that they are swapped and taken out, and that you're actually changing them more than once in a day, because some people will do an 8 hour. I'm talking like 4 hour stints for a tip out, and at the very bare minimum a rinse, and then if you can swap it out for one that has been sterilized. And sterilizing a menstrual cup can be a flash boil, it can be apple cider vinegar, it can also be a foaming cleanser that some companies will make specific for their menstrual cups, or ones that just are not going to degrade the silicone. And so if you're doing that, then particularly because, again, I deal with people with recurrent infections, so this is causing an issue because they already have an issue, then you're actually working with a practice that's a little bit better for that area and is going to relieve it. Because the thing with a menstrual cup is that we don't leave tampons in for prolonged periods of time, but we do a menstrual cup. And there is preliminary research that suggests that menstrual cups will also grow those microbes that are associated with toxic shock syndrome, which is what is associated with the worst case scenario of leaving a tampon in for too long as well. So it's not that just because it's not cotton or it's not a tampon that it doesn't grow those microbes. So we do need to clean them out as well. And so those type of recommendations that I just gave are suitable for any silicone type device. To wash and cleanse them. And then if you're dealing with crystals or glass, then obviously you're not boiling them on a stove, but you're possibly using, again, a soap and water, and giving that a good wash. But the soap, you wouldn't want it to be one that's going to cause issues for you, so it needs to be good quality. Or apple cider vinegar. Again, apple cider vinegar is interesting. There is research on apple cider vinegar and the types of microbes that it can actually inhibit, and it is used a lot in pelvic physio practices to actually clean inserted devices like pessary rings and things like that. So it is quite effective. And you're diluting it around about a 30% dilution. So using that is quite a good way as well if you're using it in between, and then popping it into a little bag rather than chucking it in your drawer, those type of things, which is just a little bit more common sense, are good practices as well to be using, and then making decisions on whether you retire them to the shelf if there's any imperfections or if they're not working with your body as well.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, thanks for that. It's really good to know. And also very affirming that I've been giving the correct care advice to my customers. Okay. So I really like to give the listeners something sort of tangible that they can walk away with and implement today. So say we've got someone listening who may feel like, maybe there's a little bit funky down there, nothing too serious, but they're just kind of inquiring and they want to have like the healthiest, most vibrant, juicy, beautiful, natural pussy ever. What are some things that you could recommend that they can start doing today? Maybe they need to make an appointment to see a specialist like yourself to get properly checked, but what are some of the holistic things that they can do today to start, it's to start supporting their vagina microbiome?
Yeah, so a good quality diet, so one that includes lots of vegetables and fruit and doesn't have processed foods in it, is a very key component of that, and a big diversity as well of plant foods. The more diverse our diet is in plant foods, the better it is able to support a microbiome anywhere in our body. So that is a key thing, and that will also help with any sort of menstrual issues as well, and as is checking in on your poo, making sure that you're doing that well. So those are some very basic things. Then if you're, the eating and consumption of fermented foods is a very important part of that as well, and particularly if we're dealing with the vagina and you're tolerating it, what they call lactoferments, so things that you have lactobacilli bacteria in them. So it can be things like yogurts, or and they don't necessarily have to be dairy-based yogurts. You can lactoferment coconut and things like that as well, and that as a daily practice has been shown as well to help populate the vagina with those microbes. And for those people that don't tolerate that, then certainly there are female specific probiotics out there that contain the strains that we find in the research that would only require one a day orally to be taken, and then that can also help support that area if there is infection tendency or if you're finding that it's not quite right. So those would be some very basic things that are could be doing on a daily basis. And of course, we've talked about washing and not overwashing, and certainly sitting with it and thinking that, stop micro-focusing is something I talk with my clients a lot about, because the more you fixate on the fact that this could be abnormal, the more you worry about it and the more that it becomes abnormal even when it's not. And so that's also something that you need to maybe think about as well. And then, certainly for me, it is, if you have concerns, is get it checked out, if you haven't had a pap screen or an STI screen, or you haven't had a swab in a long while, I would go do that so that you've got some peace of mind. Or if there is something there, it can be dealt with. And certainly there are a variety of ways to deal with non-STI infections as well. It doesn't necessarily have to always be pharmaceutical. And there should be practitioners that you can, resource and seek help with as well.
Yeah. Awesome. That's great. Okay. Thank you so much. I've just got a couple of quick cues that I like to finish on. And the first one is, how do you cultivate more pleasure in your life?
Oh, yeah, it's not that great at the moment. How do I cultivate more pleasure? I do have some good mental practices where I am able to just let go of things and seek joy and pleasure in very small things in my life. So it's not mostly with my family and how I interact with both my partner and my son, but just sitting back and realizing I don't have to get upset or agitated about things, that it's okay, and that I can just relax into it and I can do things another day. So that's my main point at the moment, I guess, and just, relaxing a little bit more is a big key for me.
I love it. Perfect. That sounds like relaxation sounds very pleasurable. Yeah. So the next question is, what's one thing you've learned about self-love recently?
Oh gosh, what have I learned about self-love? That everybody does it differently, and that's okay. In that what I see as loving myself and being kind to myself is very different to what other people see. So my clients particularly teach me a lot about what that means, and that there is no guilt in loving and respecting myself either. And that's how it should be, I think. So no judgment, no guilt.
Amen. I love that. Thank you for sharing. And my final question is, what is the most impactful book that you've ever read? And I know that it's like asking you to choose your favorite child, because there are many amazing books in the world, but you can only choose one.
Oh my gosh, because you know what? When I read for pleasure, I read sci-fi fiction.
I love that. Oh my gosh. I need to get some sci-fi fiction books off you, because I looked at my bookshelf and it's all like, self-help, mindfulness, meditation, like workbooks. I'm just like, gosh, I just need like a playbook. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So because I tend to avoid self-help books, because what I use them is more like a reference book where I just read a chapter here and there. But I do like a read from beginning to end. So, and in that arena, I would probably put it down to an impactful author rather than a book, because this author has probably about 20 books that I've read multiple times over. And that would be Raymond E. Feist, and he's a sci-fi fantasy writer. So it's a really great blend of magic and castles and, all of that sort of stuff. So.
Oh, I love it. Sounds very Game of Thrones magic.
Yeah, it's a bit like that. Yeah.
I love it. I love it. Awesome. And I'll add that in the show notes for anyone who wants to intrigue. I love how you named the author. That was a very great way to get out of just choosing the one book. Very good. Very good. Oh, thank you so much. This has been amazing. It's really good to get into the nitty-gritty and the science behind this stuff, because, I'm on a big mission to bring like sexuality and sexual health to the overall wellness table, as I really believe that it's all integrative. So thank you for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge. And yeah, it's just been an honor to have you on the show.
Oh, thank you very much for having me, and thank you for doing what you do, and let's keep doing it and empowering everybody to be healthy in all areas.
Yes, amen. Amen to that. If you enjoyed this episode, hit like and subscribe on your favorite podcast app. And don't forget to share it with someone who you think could benefit from hearing it too. You can also sign up for Lalulah news and stay up to date with all the juicy content that we only share on email. And I want to take a moment to honor you for following your curiosity and prioritizing your pleasure in this way. And until next time, thank you so much for listening, and I'll be back with another episode soon.